Well, shalomi homies. How are you doing today? A little time for some outdoor studio. Yes. I've got the birds round about me. It might be a little bit rowdy. They're feasting and gorging right now because we love to feed the birds. It's so fun. It's something simple you can do. Even if you're not raising animals of your own, you can change their lives. Bring some beautiful nature right out your front door. Feed the birds. Make them happy. Make friends with crows. Don't forget what happened to Elijah. They fed him. Isn't that just a peculiar story? You ever really think about that and consider that one like heavily? Just sit for a little while and consider that the Father took care of a man who was obedient to his voice. He had like the ultimate showdown. You ever think about Elijah, you guys? Eliyahu, as his name was maybe a little more accurately pronounced. I'm not diehard about any of that stuff, you guys. Just something to consider. Did you ever consider that? He has this showdown, ultimate ridiculous showdown with some of the most dangerous people on the face of the earth. You know, master occultists. Like, for real. You ever consider Jezebel? She's butchering the prophets relentlessly. Her job was to turn like the DHS. She's like organizing the Department of Homeland Security to target all of the righteous people. That was like her MO, modus operandi. She created the top 10 most wanted lists and just sent out executioners, special kill teams to go after them all. Targeting of them. That was her whole world. She was hunting them down and butchering them and killing them all. And so the right-hand man to the king, King Ahab, was actually a follower of Yahuah, kept his ways, walked in his commands, and the Father protected him and shielded him and watched over him. Right there, the epicenter of darkness. He was a double agent. It's beautiful. And he was literally taking the provisions that he was getting out of the wealth from the king and the queen, and he was smuggling food and supplies to hide a bunch of the prophets of Yahuah in caves, feeding them bread and water. It's awesome. But Elijah has this like ridiculous showdown with master occultists. He's like, it's not going to rain until I say so. And then the father's like, get out of here. Book it, son. You go into hiding. Straight up witness protection time in a ditch. You're like, what? It calls it a wadi. It's like a ditch. A little spring, a brook running through it. And he's like, and he appointed the crows. Praise Yah for the crows. Go crows. To feed him. Brought him bread and meat. Morning and evening. It's beautiful. It's marvelous. Something to consider. Let's just open up your life to consider that for a moment. It's something I've been pondering lately because, you know, I went down a little bit of a dive into the studies of non-denominationalism. I went to churches, a lot of different churches, they had this branding of non-denominationalism. And it was something I started considering, like, are they really non-denominational? Or is that just maybe a modern branding? Is that just a way that we can clickbait people into the door so that they don't think we're a part of another larger congregation? But in almost all instances, when you examine carefully the real about us in the church, or if you ask the people what are their core values and doctrinal beliefs, they're going to align with various different denominations, but they're just not wanting to admit it on the front page of the door anymore. It's kind of a hiding in plain sight tactics that's changed over time. And you see this versions of churchianity and Christianity that goes through these amalgamations over the years, and you see the fruit. If you examine carefully the fruit of what comes out of these different movements and branches and sects, you'll see some pitfalls, some prodigiously dangerous ideologies that are infecting very carefully and strategically. And much of what I began to see, like for instance, we went to this place where Chelsea and I met. I wrote about it in our book, A Little More, Snatched from the Flame. So I talked about meeting her. The book starts out with a beautiful love story. It's wonderful. It's captivating. And then it all turns to death and chaos and violence and murder and horrible, insane master occultists coming after us. You know, the usual. And I'm trying to get out of this Luciferian family stuff. Some of you guys are right the heck in there right now. Pray for people. Something to consider. Pray for people, even the ones you don't know, who are fighting for their lives and fighting for their families and their children. There is an absolute war that leads to incredible amounts of violence and bloodshed and torment of soul that people endure because of their beliefs and their convictions. And we as brothers and sisters should intercede for each other. Like, though we're not blood brothers, you know what I'm saying? Not from the same mama. I'll tell you what, you become brothers in the blood of Messiah together when we enter into covenant with Yahuah. And that makes us powerfully linked in our ability to intercede with bowels of mercy, like it describes Yeshua having these bowels of mercy when he would pray. He would be churned up, like in the depths of your guts. You know, you ever just been stirred up for compassion just feeling horrifically grieved for people that are grieved. I had some major anguish of soul moments this week. I had a lot of phone calls and exchanges with people that are going through unimaginable challenges and tragedies. And there's times when that welling up from within makes us pray in a way that we just can't otherwise. And for those of you that have suffered much in this life, who are suffering much, it is producing in you an ability to relate, an ability to consider the gravity of someone's situation that otherwise could not be related to you. It makes you recognize it for what it is. It makes you be able to have empathy in a way that just is otherwise impossible for you to have. You know, when you consider people like Abram, why did the Father allow so many of these different trials and circumstances to take place in his life? Why did he call him to be a sojourner? Well, you see throughout the course of his life the fruit of what came from that, the convictions of what his children would go through and his grandchildren and great grandchildren, that they would experience the persecutions, the blessings, the challenges of being sojourners, not having a real dwelling place on the earth. And you'll see this consistent theme throughout the word and throughout a lot of people's lives in today in modernity, where we experience persecutions that force us to pick up and leave very unexpectedly at times, places where we found peace or resting, and suddenly that peace leaves, or there's contention, or there's issues or persecution. We have to flee from it. I talk to a lot of people now from overseas, a lot more than I ever had. And you get to experience what others are never. I mean, we aren't granted a lot of opportunities to really know what's going on in other places of this world because of our localized isolationism. We are fed a very small, force-fed diet of what we think the world really is, based off of predominantly our media and the books and the histories of what we're given throughout our life. And it shapes in us a cultural worldview of how society should run and navigate. But we are bereft of wisdom about experiences that so many others are really going through, what it's actually like for them, you know, because of that divide, because of allegiances, alliances, and petty griefs and discontentions and fighting amongst our leaders. And so because of that, we're left with a lack of ability to really understand much of what's going on with our brothers and sisters abroad. But I encourage you all to continue to dive in for praying and interceding for our brothers and sisters who are out there living in a much more heavily persecuted environment, because that's one of those things that in many ways we lack here in America, that has made us so much more easily beguiled, in my opinion, because it's softened us. It's allowed us to be lulled into a comfortable casualness about our walk and about our life, that is because we don't suffer much when it comes to how we desperately follow his ways. But you at any time could volunteer for the front line and get actively engaged in warfare by starting to do the dangerous things, like to tear down the strongholds that are in your life, to intercede for others around you. I'm telling you, you can get well into major kick in the teeth spiritual warfare, physical challenges in your life anytime you want to jump in and volunteer for the front line. You know, the vast majority of real combat, it's more than 90% of soldiers are not participants generally in the active act of combat. They are, even if the front line, just the front line itself, compared to those that are just a little bit tertiary, those that are behind that, are going to have completely different experiences in this life. And for those that are well into the front engagement with the enemy, actively contending for the souls of men, seeking to set captives free, laying hands and praying for people to be delivered from diseases, from demons, and fighting for those that are weary and worn out. Like it says in the book of Judges about Gideon and his soldiers, they were pursuing the enemy, and it said they were weary but still pursuing. And I know that's the condition a lot of people are in right now. They're weary but still pursuing. And that lack of reinforcements, like Gideon and his men came to a city that's other Israelites, and they're like, hey, can you give us some bread? We're starving. We've been chasing these guys for stinking ever. Please help us. And they're like, no. He's like, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to chastise you with the briars of the wilderness. I'm going to whip you, boy. And he does. He comes back and whips the snot out of them with briars, savage, thorny little things to destroy them. Another town he runs to for reinforcements, expecting the other believers in that community to help him. No, to persecute him, and they mock him and they belittle him and they attack him. And he's like, I'm going to come back. I'm going to kill all the men. He does. Dead, son. There's consequences when you treat people terribly. Something to consider. You know what I mean? But there is this experiences of what we saw here in America going to this non-denominational church at the time. It was a fast-growing non-denominational church. It was called Flatirons Community Church in Lafayette, Colorado. And Colorado's Front Range has notoriously been a stronghold for a lot of the evangelical Christian community, more so centered in Colorado Springs, Colorado, with New Life Church and focus on the family. That was a very big, strong, Christianized, militarized community that had been drawn and attracted there and marketed to be there. That being said, and I did go to New Life Church when my family was, when I was young, teen, 12, 13, 14 years old, in that time frame of my life. And they had the frat there for initiates to be participants of, for the young men to get initiated into. No joke. You always end up finding these freak show weird secret initiation societies that start to percolate themselves into these churches for a reason, because there's lack of shepherding. There's a lack of the fear of Yahuah. My contention generally is that the greatest failure in the body of westernized Christianity is a failure to fear, to revere, to fear Yahuah, our creator. To lack of fear of him has led to it's led to foolishness predominantly. It's led to the inability to see and understand the real enemy at the gates. The lack of reverence for Yahuah has led to the fear of men. It's led to the fear of failure. It's led to the fear of not being relevant, culturally relevant. It's led to the adaptation of business strategies and multiculturalism and this watering down of the gospel to get to such a point of tolerance that it's no longer salty, so everybody can drink from it. So therefore our numbers are up. So I ended up going to this church there for a while that began to have this huge explosive growth and what was so attractive about it was their friendly, casual openness to have people who were broken be welcome there, to be there. That this is a place where you could come and find a home, where you could casually bump into Jesus, was the way that it was described. But over time, that message continued to get watered down. And the big distinction came there when they accepted a deal with the city that was basically a big real estate deal, so that they could have a massive complex that was, I don't think it was a former Kmart, maybe a huge super metropolitan size shopping center. They were going to basically give that to the church. But there's always a little catches, because this is a place that was doing millions and millions of dollars a year of revenue. You want to call it donations and tithes and whatnot, but there's revenue, massive amounts of it that were coming through it. I think last I looked, it was more like over $20 million a year that was coming into this place. Now, over time, what happened, though, is once that deal got made, there was a massive change in what their actual stances of biblical morality were and how they were applied versus the allowance of greater transgression. More sin was tolerated. More sin was relished and allowed. But along the way, what happened is it starts to drive out, and what you see consistently is it'll drive out people that are more biblically literate, and it'll allow people that are biblically illiterate to propagate. And so it creates this horrifically effective feedback loop to destroy what is pure and lovely and righteous that is in that community. And they began to adopt, in particular, the biggest changes began to take place was when a movement came in there that was the project that began to infiltrate was this fraternal organization that was called the Crucible. And the Crucible was represented as this workshop, retreat, men's movement, and they also have stuff for women and children that got developed over the course of time. But initially, the way it was introduced to us was this ferociously intense retreat that you could go to really work out major issues and strongholds and troubles that you had going on in your life. And our pastor became fanatically obsessed with it and just absolutely loved it. However, it was a secret. What happened there, what they did there, one of the core tenets that they were all about was not talking about what happened at the Crucible. And screaming giant red flags should be going off for most of you, because the initiations and the rites and the rituals of what was being adopted and practiced and actually utilized there were really co-adopted from a amalgamation of different mystical religious ideologies and Christianity, biblical Christianity. And one of the main figureheads of that is a guy named Carl Jung. Jungian psychology was one of the big elements of what was being utilized there in something that's called shadow work. And now, one of the tenets of a lot of Jungian psychology is diving into a form of mysticism that is masquerading in all kinds of different attributes and lights. Now, one of the things that any of you that have not studied Carl Jung, it's not something you necessarily need to do in any regard, but some of you out there have already been caught up in doing that. And I would encourage you to consider one of the books that was not published by his for more than 50 years after his death, which is called The Red Book. And understanding Carl Jung was very openly communicating with demons and these other spirits from the behind the veil, and clearly not sons of the righteous whatsoever. And so that book, which I believe he wrote it from 1915 through 1930, he wrote it over 30 years of his life. And it deals with a lot of the real dark metaphysical practices of what he was actually a participant to. Now, so anytime when you see a Christian community adopting Jungian psychology, as a means of bringing about beneficial inputs to people that are coming there for help and for healing, you should have such strong cautionary things. I mean, we had a lot of people, a lot of the leadership, basically, it ended up turning into this deal where if you weren't going to go to the crucible, you were not going to be tolerated as staff or on leadership. And so it became a place where there was almost a shunning of everybody who didn't go and participate in it. Even the pastor came back with big old tattoos all about it, how he became a Magi, one of he became a priest in that order. It was just like, it was this degradation to it. And I mean, the church even got to a place where they were going to have the school, like the children's school, become all about the crucible, take over and help to facilitate and run it. I mean, it completely infested the entire church and drove out another wave of people that were not tolerating it. But my friends, even when I tried to ask him, tell me about the specifics of it, they were like, oh, I'll pay for you to go, man. It's going to be so good for you. And I was like, well, tell me exactly what happens there. And they're like, I can't tell you about it. And I was like, why the heck am I going to go to some secret society whatsoever to begin with? Anyways, this infiltration of mysticism has taken place so effectively because there is a distinction of a destruction, I would say, of the shepherds over the body of Messiah. There has been a rampant eradication of the righteous from the positions of leadership where they can be well versed in the word and have a zero tolerance to this kind of behavior, that they don't tolerate in any regard secret society members, that there is no toleration of other oath-keeping societies to come into our church and be members here, or let alone be on the staff or even on the worship band. Like, there's none of that. Instead, there is a rapid adaptation to this. And you got to understand the willingness of what these, occultists really believe is a form of chameleonic behavior where they'll alter themselves to fit in. And this is the stuff fundamentally, if you read through for yourself, and I encourage you to do it, challenge you to do it, read through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings in their entirety. It will give you this historical examination of the nation of Israel from their actual kind of origin points, where the two houses were united, where the house of Israel and the house of Judah were actually united, until this breaking apart of the two houses, the separation of the tribes, and the rampant infestation of idolaters, adulterers, sorcerers, occultists, how that practice began to interweave itself from the very beginnings. You don't even to the end of the books, where they're finally getting the judgment coming on their head for all of these horrific practices. The idols and the altars, the shrines, the special secret dedicated places for where human infanticide, just the destroying of your children for the sake of receiving spiritual power, that were built in the days of Solomon. Hundreds and hundreds of years, these things persisted in that kingdom, not being torn down, not being eradicated, not being driven out. For all the different changes of leadership, this stuff was guarded and protected. And when I look around in my society today, here in America, I see so many of the screaming hallmarks of what you find when you're well entrenched into the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. You start to see how leaders effectively turned the hearts of the people away from following the scriptures and inclined them to idolatry, inclined them to moral relativism, and an adaptation of polyculturalism to where we can take in all of these other doctrines and ideologies, and the fruit of it is being borne out, where to me you see judgments, reaping judgments because of that. For instance, jump in with me to the very end of that historical analysis here. The book of 2 Kings chapter 16 and 17 really is the culmination of the end of it. And Yahuwah gives a really nice description as to why Israel, the house of Israel, so this is like the 10 tribes, why they're judged, why he brings in the Assyrians, as they're called in this translation, Asher, why he raises up Asher to bring about destruction to this nation, because these things may have very strong parallels to why the Father will literally raise up adversaries against us, why he might choose to raise up China or Russia or these other nation states, the people of the East, to be the hands of justice and retribution for our idolatry. And it's, some of you may have a hard time swallowing that pill, but from when I read the scriptures, I see very clearly that the Father raises up nations. He raises up an axe to hew down a tree of his own vineyard if he chooses. And that's what Babel was. That's what Nebuchadnezzar was. That's what Salmanasar, these kings of Syria, this was their literal job in life, was to be their hands of justice for Yahuwah, to judge his own people, because they had gotten so far desensitized to absolute atrocious things happening and tolerating it in their own neighborhoods, in their own houses, in the churches, that it had become normalized. It had become well accepted and well adopted. But the Father was not having that. And so read with me some of the fruit of what came from that tolerance movement. This is chapter 17 and verse 7. Now this came, I'll back up for a second so you guys can get a hint of it. We'll just jump into the full chapter. In the 12th year of Ahaz, the sovereign of Yehudah, so that's the king over the house of Yehudah, Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, began to reign over Yisrael in Shamaron, Samaria, for 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of Yahuwah, but not as the sovereigns of Yisrael who were before him. Shalmaneser, sovereign of Asher, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and rendered him a present. But the sovereign of Asher found a conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to Sol, the sovereign of Mitzrayim, and had not brought a present to the sovereign of Asher as year by year. And the sovereign of Asher shut him up and bound him in prison. And the sovereign of Asher went through all the land and went up to Shamaron and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the sovereign of Asher captured Shamaron and exiled Yisrael to Asher and settled them in Halah and Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So later on in scripture, you will hear a lot of references to the scattering of the lost sheep of the house of Israel, or the scattering of his sheep, his flock. This is the literal 0 point of that story. And anytime you're reading about it, this is what he's referring to. The people from the house of Israel, all the tribes, were captured and were scattered ultimately to the 4 corners of the earth. This is what all throughout scripture, as you read later on, you'll hear about this regathering, this promised restoring, where he is going to go to the 4 corners of the earth and regather his people that were scattered in the sea, in the Galil of the nations, the sea of the nations, literally the Gentiles of the nations, where they're mixed and mingled and infested all over the world. He's going to gather them and make a greater exodus for their return to his land and to his kingdom than the days of Moses. It says that it will be so amazing, so awe-inspiring and miraculous that people in the end of days in the kingdom to come won't even talk about the exodus of Moshe. They'll talk about the returning of the house of Israel from the 4 corners of where they were scattered. He will undo what was done here, and he will bring back all of those righteous remnant that scattered amongst the flock. It's a beautiful thing, something to consider. And as you're reading along, to pay attention to, like when you're in the book of Isaiah, you're going to hear these things. I'm going to gather them from all the nations where I've driven them, from the 4 corners. You can just make annotations of these things. These are pivotal events that have a lot to do with end times eschatology, a lot more to do with end times eschatology than a pre-tribulation rapture. But it doesn't get anywhere near the press coverage because it doesn't have, Luciferian backing. It doesn't have the Freemasonic societies backing up an ideological pursuit that makes people shut up and sit down and be quiet until waiting that day that they'll be raptured and get out of here. It's created a lot of passivity in the body of Messiah. Just something to consider. I encourage you to examine it carefully for yourself and its origins and do some studies on where it came from and who's behind it and what it creates in culture of passivity. Or it's like, yeah, we'll just sit down. We're just going to wait till the rapture. We'll be fine. It's not war to the end. Why don't we just pray to be the last man standing? That's my encouragement. I think we should all be praying that we could be the last people standing here trying to set captives free and preach the gospel to every creature like we've been commanded to. But something to consider. Now, this came to be because the children of Yisrael had sinned against Yahuah their Elohim, who had brought them up out of the land of Mitzrayim, from under the hand of Pharaoh, sovereign of Mitzrayim, and feared other mighty ones, and walked in the laws of the nations, whom Yahuah had dispossessed from before the children of Yisrael, and of the sovereigns of Yisrael that they had made. Do you understand here real quick? When he's making a reference to Yahuah who brought them up out of the land of Mitzrayim, that's that first commandment, I am Yahuah. I am Yahuah who brought you up out of the land of Mitzrayim, out of the house of bondage. That's the beginning of the 10 commandments. That's the laws, the Torah, the instructions of Yahuah that he's gave. First and foremost is he's like, I went and got you. I went and ransomed you and brought you to myself. But instead you went and picked up the literal laws, the instructions, like the law of sin and death. That's the guiding book that guides the kingdom of darkness. That's their laws. They went and picked those up and were like, hey, we can practice these rites, these rituals, these festivals, these holidays. We pick these things up and amalgamate them into our own religion. We will be a powerful people unto ourselves, because look at how great and powerful these other nations were. You literally have kings. As you start to read through here, you'll have kings who will cry out to Yahuah. He will deliver them. And then later on, they will cry out to these other mighty ones, and they'll be like, you know what? We have these other kings that are coming and attacking us. Maybe we should go to their nation, figure out what their altars are made like, go and learn how they worship their gods, come back here, build an altar to them that matches the specifications of theirs. Then if they come to attack us, we'll pray to their gods to deliver us from their hands, and we'll be successful. This is the kind of idiocracy that you sit there and you look at and you're like, yeah, but then I can turn around and see the same fruitfulness of that taking place in my life, in the lives of the people around me, in the churches that I grew up in. And you're like, we do the same daggone thing when he's trying to deliver us out of adultery with these other ways of living. And he's like, that's not what I intended for you whatsoever. That's not the set apart life that I would like you to have. And if we carefully examine my wife and I's life back at that time when we were going to that church early on, we looked very similar to the world. And we felt sick and disgusted about it. After a while, you start to realize we're not much different from the world. We talk about the Lord, we talk about God, we talk about Jesus. And at the same time, we were very much spiritually, temperature-wise, about as hot as a really old potato. You know what I mean? Like, we were not on fire for the kingdom. We were not zealously proclaiming his ways. We weren't walking in his spirit by a long stretch of the imagination. And because of that, there was a lack of fruit in our life that was relevant and evident on a regular basis. The fruit that ends up coming from that is a lot of people who look at the word or look at the Father and they reject him and his word because they don't see the same fruits. They don't see the transformative power of his spirit in them. And because of that, they leave the faith. And we saw this in an absolutely massive amount. We watched a lot of our pastors drop out of the church and go ahead and just enter into business and just pursue business and abandon ministry over and over and over again. And we were like, dang, it just took so many of what, in my opinion, were some very, very effective leaders in the kingdom who were zealous and on fire for the kingdom, but were gradually whittled away by compromise, gradually whittled away by losing their first love. They were lost in a war of attrition. And I'm going to read to you from another book here in a minute. Ooh, it is getting cold. Bear with me here. It's Game of Gods. That's the book. Carl Tykereb's Game of Gods. We're going to go into some of his section on where these things come from. Where do these people come from? And why is it that they're so capable of being chameleons like that? Whew. Praise Yah for wives that repurpose cashmere sweaters in the thick of winter. We had a really mild day here. It was so nice. We all got outside. But now, of course, it's back in the 20s. I know you Canadians right here, you always laugh at me when we talk about how cold it is down here, but understand, I live more in the south. I live like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles south of there for a reason. My wife does not bode super well in the winter. I like it. I enjoy it. I'm very thankful for it, but not everyone in my family is so predisposed to it. Understand that affects us tremendously. So like when we get crazy cold snaps like this, when we go through cold snaps like this, infrastructure freezes because they only dig they bury water lines out here like 8 inches below the surface, not 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, like 8 inches. And they're like, oh no, everything's bursting because it got down to, 6 degrees with the wind chill factor and for weeks. That's why it's so catastrophic. And some of you guys mock and you're like, you guys are silly. You're closing the roads for an inch of snow. And it's like, these folks don't even have a snowplow. Like the whole entire county, there's not a snowplow. They're using bulldozers. They're using road scrapers. It's comical, but it's not. It's also pretty catastrophic. So same thing if you guys over in the UK get 110 degrees Fahrenheit. If you guys were smoking hot, vast majority of you guys in Europe don't have air conditioners and you don't have the same cooling and heating systems like we do over here. So if you get heat like we get over here, you're lots of people just die. So anyway, something to consider. I'm distracted. It's cold. Anyways, let's get back to it. Let's get back to really what was the pitfalls that led them into this destructive pattern of life. Now, the children, verse 9, and the children of Yisrael secretly did against Yahuah their Elohim matters that were not right, and they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower unto the walled city, and set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree, and burned incense there on all the high places, like the nations whom Yahuah had removed from their presence. And they did evil matters to provoke Yahuah, and served the idols, of which Yahuah had said to them, do not do this. And Yahuah warned Yisrael and Yehudah through all of his prophets and every seer, saying, turn back from your evil ways, guard my commands and my laws according to all the Torah which I command your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But they did not listen, and hardened their necks like the necks of their fathers, who did not put their trust in Yahuah their Elohim, and rejected his laws and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his witnesses which he had witnessed against them, and went after worthlessness and became worthless, and after the nations who were all around them, of whom Yahuah had commanded them not to do like them. They left all the commands of Yahuah their Elohim, and made for themselves a molded image, 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and bowed themselves to all the hosts of heaven, and served Baal, and caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire, and practiced divination and sorcery, and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of Yahuah, to provoke him. That's a brutal list of accusations made against them, that not only was he gracious enough to send people to warn them, to call them back, to extend mercy, to extend grace, to extend offerings of repentance, to rebuild and restore and to protect and to deliver. He offered them the ability to come back into a right relationship with him over and over and over again. And this is why I'm so passionate about trying to encourage people to just read the word for themselves, to actually, even if you're brand new, even if you're like never in your life have you been ever considering being somebody who devoted themselves to read the word, I just challenge you. If you're entering into a relationship with someone, get to know them, get to know their story, get to know their life. You spend a lot of time getting to know someone as you're pursuing them to be a spouse, someone you're going to potentially live the rest of your life with. I mean, you should spend some seriously deliberate time getting to know them and their intricacies before you agree to sign up for that class. You know what I'm saying? Like one of my friends put it very well. Marriage is like picking up a loaded revolver. It's like maybe just loading a single round into a revolver, spinning the chamber and handing it to your spouse, trusting that they won't pull the trigger. That's kind of what marriage really is, because at the end of the day, many of you have experienced what it's like when a relationship inside of a marriage goes south. And it may as well just be that person using that gun against their spouse. You know what I'm saying? Nobody knows you in all the goodness and all of the horrible badness like your spouse does. And because of that, When you enter into a relationship with them, the consequences of those choices and the actions that you take together have much bigger ripples in a pond than any single one of you could have individually, because then there's children involved, then there's in-laws and all kinds of other families together. It's a huge ordeal, and it should never be entered into lightly. If you are not careful to know that you are on the same page about a lot of these topics, don't enter into that relationship. And that's why I'm not fanatical about saying every single person needs to come into this walk and repent and come into this walk and be a part of it. I think you shouldn't do that until you're absolutely certain that that's what you want to be a part of, because this is a big deal and it should be weighed heavily. It should be examined carefully. There is a call upon the life of someone's life if they are being drawn by his Holy Spirit, unless the Father is drawing them to their Son through Yeshua, to have that relationship and enter into a covenanted relationship with him. That stuff should all be weighed very carefully and heavily. And so for those of you that want to know really what it is you're signing up for and who it is you're getting into a relationship with, read the word for yourself thoroughly. Because if you just read the book of John, or if you just read the book of Matthew, these are all beneficial things. However, you're going to lack contextual understanding for so much of the story that you will miss much of the meat of the matter. And you can get along with milk for a while, the early phase of your development, just like an infant can. However, you're going to reach a point in development and maturity where you cannot survive on the milk. You can live technically, but you're not doing anything other than existing. And that's what a lot of believers, when you examine their life, they get stuck in the milk phase, because the majority of what the churches are dispensing out there is fat-free milk. They're like, we got skim milk on demand. It's like, yeah, you ever feed skim milk to pigs? They get the fattest, the fastest, you know? It's just, oh, we live in a world of insanity. If I want to buy raw milk, I have to buy it from the dog food section of life. I'm serious. I live in a place where it's illegal to sell raw milk to a person unless you say it's only for animal consumption. I love the tradecraft when somebody's being sneaky to get around a stupid law. However, it's insanity that we say that the raw version of a product is more dangerous than the actual pasteurized, homogenized, death-dealing white nectar of death that often people get. I cannot drink. I'm one of those people that if I drink like pasteurized milk, I get the stinky bits coming out of my rear end. I stink up the house, son. So it's a prodigious chemical warfare attack against the family that lives with me. So I'm a huge fanatic for raw stuff. I love it. Raw milk, raw cheese, wonderful stuff. But if you try to live your entire life on a version of it that's been watered down and boiled off and nutrients stripped out of it and enzymes taken out of it, you're left lacking. And the literal gut biome of your body cannot support so much of the neurological processes that are necessary for critical thought. And that's why people are stupid, because their guts are sick and then their brain is foggy and tired and exhausted and they can't think and contemplate. But that's what most believers get if they don't read the word for themselves and know what it has to say and become well versed and well trained up to know, hey, this then is how I should live. So if you throw out the first half of this book or the first 2/3 of this book and you're ignorant of what the Torah has to say, the instructions of Yahuah have to say, you're left very open to and vulnerable to a lot of decisive, destructive attacks on yourself, your identity, your purpose, how to learn your spiritual authority and engagement. What does the Father expect of you? Like, why is the Sabbath important? Like, why did that matter to him? Why was it that he gave us these feast days, these festivals? What did they have to do with him? The prophecies about his son and his coming restoration of the entire earth. You miss all of these tapestries of beauty when you only pick up a small snippet of the book. And so I encourage y'all, if you read it from beginning to end, you'll see this incredible story play out, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, and all in between. And you'll see woven throughout there is the people that throw the Torah over their shoulders. They throw his book, his word over their backs, and they ignore him and they move off, and they inevitably pick up the ways of the nations. It's not that there will be a picking up of other biblical doctrine. They will inevitably also include in there an amalgamation of worldliness, of idolatry, because lawlessness literally is the spirit of iniquity. It's the spirit of the Antichrist that's gone into all the world to try to lead people away from following the Father, from following his Son. That is the infectious spirit that's at play continually. Let me show you for an example. Let me show you how it works in modernity today. Because I did not believe that my pastor at the time, gosh, what was his name? Jim Bergen. I don't believe Jim Bergen had a evil intention going into being the pastor of Flatiron's church, that in any way whatsoever, that he thought he would get to a place in his career where he is literally adopting all these strange Eastern medicine Eastern religious practices and calling people to do transcendental meditation rituals in the church. That was like the last service my wife and I ever went to, and they're calling us to clear our minds and to start to allow this stuff. We were like, we're done. We're done here. I'm like, this has gone completely the other end. But that's the spiritual infection that got into that church. I don't think he had any intention of going there from the beginning. That was not on his desires. However, the spirit of seduction is incredibly powerful and potent, and it came to this reality because there's very subtle, crafty individuals who are working deliberately day and night to terrain map the churches that are effective, the places where there's real effective, fervent pursuit of the truth. The enemy works diligently through his agents on the earth to eradicate places where that's going on. He works hard to blot them out of existence. And he's done that through people that have adopted what is being pushed out there into the world is this oneism. That is not basically the premise of oneism is that all of things are interconnected. All things, it's not twoism, that there is an outside creator, Yahuwah Elohim Sevaoth, unique and set apart from all of creation, who created all the rest. The oneism adaptation is that there is a divineness in all things, Now, there's many different branches filtering through that, but the adaptation of that ideological pursuit is based on the belief that you get access to this power, to godhood, through transgression. By transgressing, you can transcend and become like a god. That's the beginning basis of all of these strongholds that come out of here. Now, we're going to jump into The Game of Gods by Karl Tykarev, chapter 12. Turn with me if you have it. If not, just read along with me for a second here. Have a second here. This is on page 90. And in this chapter, he is discussing the spiritual politics. And he's jumping into an examination of what do Masonic orders believe, and then what do other religious adaptations of it in something that's called perennial spirituality believe. So check this out. Page 389. Melvin M. Johnson, considered by many scholars to be the greatest American Freemason of the 20th century, recognized the dynamics of religious universalism within the craft. A craft is a reference to the Masonic order. His assessment demonstrates the crucial importance of its pluralistic spirit. Masonry is not, and I quote, Masonry is not Christian, nor is it Mohammedan, nor Jewish, nor to be classified by the name of any other sect. The power which has held it together, the chemical which has caused its growth, the central doctrine which makes it unique is the opportunity it affords men of every faith happily to kneel together at the same altar, each in worship of the God he reveres, under the universal name of Great Architect of the Universe. Here and here alone is the real universality of Freemasonry. Thus, end quote, thus and only, Johnson elaborated, can we furnish to the world at a large common base upon which all civilized mankind may unite. Do you understand? They're working towards creating a doctrine of universalism, one world religion. Fundamentally, this is the stuff that's prophesied is going to happen, that we should be on guard and looking diligently, testing the spiritual atmosphere. What's the spiritual temperature of the world? One of the hallmark indicators is there will be a unified religion, monetary system, security system, beast army, military enforcement system, and of course, the commitment to control, total dominance of governance, absolute totalitarianism. So we got to be looking for societies and groups who are advocating, pursuing that agenda. Freemasonry is one of the largest hubs on the wheel, one of the largest hubs of that process. And their infectious ideologies are very tantamount to what you'll find in a lot of the churches that we're talking about earlier. Carrying on. Long before the 1893 Parliament, Masonic scholars were ascribing a unifying religious position to their craft. Noted expert on Masonic jurisprudence, Albert Mackey, wrote the following in 1859. Masonry requires only a belief in the supreme architect of the universe. The Christian and the Jew, the Mohammedan and the Brahmin are permitted to unite around our common altar, and Masonry becomes, in practice as well as in theory, universal. The truth is that Masonry is undoubtedly a religious institution, its religion being of that universal kind in which all men agree. This aligns with Albert Pike's illumined in his massive tome, Morals and Dogma, first published in 1871. Pike had a profound influence on the craft, and his understanding of religious universalism was a key teaching. Masonry, around whose altars the Christian, the Hebrew, the Muslim, the Brahmin, the followers of Confucius, and the Zoroastrian can assemble as brethren and unite in prayer to the one God who is above all of them, the Baalim. Surveying the 20th century, Masonic scholars reveal a continuity of thought. Founder of the Philosophical Research Society, Manly P. Hall, esteemed for his knowledge of Masonic philosophy, advanced the connection between religious universalism and Freemasonry. No true Mason is creed bound, he said. He realizes with the divine illumination of his lodge that as a Mason, his religion must be universal. Christ, Buddha, or Muhammad. The name means little, for he recognizes only the light and not the bearer. He worships at every shrine, bows before every altar, whether in temple, mosque, or cathedral, realizing with his truer understanding the oneness of all spiritual truth. No true Mason can be narrow, for his lodge is the divine expression of all broadness. I'm going to pause here for a second because the same oaths, the same religious convictions and ideology are absolutely present in literally the Jesuit movement. The oaths that they swear, the extreme oaths of the Jesuit order, also advocate the ability to bow at any altar, that you can swear, you can lie, you can cheat, you can steal, you can manipulate, you can do anything you need to blot out the enemies of the Pope, to do subterfuge. And you'll find these similar approaches in all these different sects of religious orders that are out there, where there will be a form of subterfuge and deceit that's allowed and tolerated. Same thing that you'll find in many of the Islamic, especially more extremist versions of the Islamic faith, where this is also advocated. And in the Judaic practices, that they believe they can lie to a non-Jew, a goyim, that they can treat them in these same orders, that they can manipulate them, they can practice usury against them, and do all kinds of these traditions of the elders, their doctrines of Talmudic traditions that allow them the ability to do egregious sins to another person. You will find these characters of manipulative practices all through the doctrines of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. They are eating from the same spiritual fruit that Adam and Eve ate up from the serpent. They're still picking up the fruit of the serpent, and they're amalgamating it into their religious orders. And it's creating ultimately the persecutor note against those that follow and guard the ways of Yahuah and keep the testimonies of Yeshua. Like it says, the dragon is at wrath with the woman, and he goes out to persecute those who guard the commandments of Yahuah and keep the testimonies of Yeshua. At the end of it all, that's enemy number one. The most persecuted people will be them. The entire world religious order that gets united will target those people. So it should be understood it's because the power that's in those people is the pure power. It's an actual true source of life and of protection and provision and of zealous delivery of the word of truth. That is what is so dangerous in a world filled with deception. It says that the dragon goes out with all lying signs and wonders to deceive the whole world. The great deceiver, that's the grand architect of the universe that they're really referencing, is the great deceiver. Albert Pike, in that same book, Morals and Dogma, admits that the energy, the light that all of these Masons are seeking, that quest that they're on, the traveling man's pursuit, is ultimately for the light. He calls it with the seething energies of Lucifer, Hallel, as he's called in the scriptures. That's who it is they're adopting. That's the iniquity force, the power of lawlessness that they're using to enact this great work against the nations. And it's so frustrating and it's so difficult because I live in a society where these individuals who are open wearing of the rings, like I was sitting in a waiting room, and the guy's wearing Freemasonic socks. Like, I'm like, really? I've never seen that before. I've seen all kinds of branding and characters come out of different lodges, but I had never seen somebody wearing the socks. He's wearing the ring and everything else. So to some, I mean, it saturates the communities in the South. There's so many Freemason lodges. There's a Baptist church and a Freemason lodge in every holler out up in these hills. It's just ridiculous how good they were at infesting the area. Whereas the Jesuits in a totally other level are infested the South and the Southwest. Like you go down to Louisiana, you go down to New Mexico, it's just infested with so much of the stronghold that came from their works, their missionary activities, and all the rest. But I could get lost in this for a long time. But I want to stay focused. Very it's very exhausting when you realize that these people are blinded. They swear oaths and accept the fact that they will be blinded by the light of Lucifer. They are volunteering to be blinded by the light of a false god. And that's I'm trying to draw the parallel back to you when it says that they left all the commands of Yahuah their Elohim, made for themselves a molded image, 2 calves, and made an Asherah, bowed themselves to all the host of heavens, and served Baal. That's the same stinking thing as what's going on today. What Carl Teicherib is talking about is people doing the same thing. It just has a different language in the way that we describe it today. And so because of that, it's been able to be camouflaged more effectively to be delivered en masse to our society. And it's left many people beguiled by it. There's generational sins and curses that come when you have family members, you have grandparents, great grandparents, uncles, aunts, people that participated in the Daughters of the Eastern Star, people that swore oaths and practiced these religious rituals. That spiritual bondage that comes when they initiate that carries on to other children, and why I'm an advocate of people praying of renunciation of these oaths, because you may not have ever dabbled into any of this. You may have never gone into a lodge. You may have never engaged in these practices. However, what happens when somebody sits there and they swear these oaths, understand many of the spiritual enforcement of these oaths is predicated on this establishment that there's blessings and curses throughout the scripture. Please understand, it's an absolute law of reality. When someone is blessed, the Father literally says he can bless them to 1,000 generations, but he will curse to the 3rd and 4th generation. This is like in the passage of Exodus 20 when the commandments are being given. He literally says he'll curse them to the 3rd and 4th generation. What has happened in a lot of these oaths and the way that they're written is so that a familiar spirit will inheritance of the children to the 3rd and 4th generation and bestow those blessings onto that individual who's swearing the oath and steal from later generations those blessings. And you will see specific types of ailments and problems that ripple out to the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And it tends to get worse over the 3rd generation and the 4th because that demon, that generational spirit, needs another child, needs another person to swear the oaths to get legal claims to the next generations to come. And so that is why when you start to examine people's lives or you start to deal in deliverance and trying to go through and help people, you got to contend with these issues because the vast majority of churches are not explaining these things to people because they've got oath swearing, ring keeping sons of Lucifer sitting on the stage proclaiming the Bible to their congregation, neglecting to tell them about the cures that are therein. So that's why even in all the descriptions of my videos, you'll see I have a link for breaking of the curses of Freemasonry. That's there because I encourage people, use it. Try, even if you've never done it at all yourself, pray, go through the prayers. It's not going to cause any harm. It will only bring a benefit to you. And it has great long-lasting effects on your future. So this infection has gotten to such an extent that we can see the fruit of it hanging on the trees all around us. I'll carry on in Carl's book here for a minute. Once more example will suffice. Henry C. Clausen, when he was the sovereign grand commander of the Scottish Rite, preached of a mystical tie that bound all faiths. The one supreme God has been known by many names to many races of men. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Medes, the Persians, the Hebrew Kabbalists, The Druids, the Norsemen, the Brahmins, the Muslims, the Buddhists, and the North American Indians all believed in God as the one supreme ruler and creator of the universe. This belief, held by the earliest guilds of operative masonry nearly 6,000 years ago, is the same belief held by modern Freemasonry today. See, that's the kind of information that they don't tell you when you walk into the lodge. That's kind of information that they don't tell you on the surface, and this is why I'm bothered when any type of church practices would adopt a means of withholding who we really are and what we really believe from the uninitiated until they're deep into the order. And this kind of stuff is what cults operate on. They operate on an onion effect, where those on the outside are given a version of them, and as you work your way into the inner depths, then you get initiated into the other orders. It happens, and it permeates so many different practices. It's exhausting. But that sentence alone should be enough to keep the vast majority of people away from ever touching this stuff. Freemasonry presented the broad way of religious universalism through the framework of the lodge and continues to do so. Its perennial philosophy, wrapped in allegory and the spiritual quest of perfection, was an effective conduit for interfaith acceptance. Perennial spirituality. Another factor corresponding to the interfaith movement is the acceptance of perennial philosophy, the position that all spiritual traditions are connected to one metaphysical truth, one source of divine reality, that this underlying context frames all religions and our human attempts to experience the infinite. Man's attempt to grasp this divine reality, however, has resulted in the splintering of beliefs and schools of thought. And yet all of these fragments find substance in one source. Such thinking can be traced into eons of philosophical inquiry. It found reanimation in the Renaissance and reinvigoration in the age of Romanticism, and it blossomed within the mystical countercurrents of modernity. Today we hear it in the cliches, all religions are essentially the same, or all religions are pathways to the same mountain top. Oh, I gotta pause there, because you can't have that if you're someone who adheres to the teachings of Messiah. You can't uphold this. Turn with me to Philippians. Check this out. Philippians 2, chapter 2. If then there is any encouragement in Messiah, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, having the same love, one in being and of purpose, doing none at all through selfishness or self-conceit, but in humility, consider others better than yourselves. Each one should look out not only for his own interest, but for the interests of others. For let this mind be in you, which was also in Messiah Yeshua, who being in the form of Elohim, did not regard equality with Elohim a matter to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and came to be in the likeness of men. And having been found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death of a stake. Elohim therefore has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Yeshua every knee should bow, of those in heaven and of those on earth and of those under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Yeshua Messiah is Master, to the esteem of Elohim the Father. So that, my beloved, as you always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much rather in my absence, work out your own deliverance with fear and trembling. For it is Elohim who is working in you both to desire and to work for his good pleasure. Do all matters without grumblings and disputings, in order that you be blameless and faultless, children of Elohim, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked, perverse generation, among whom you shine like lights in the world, holding on to the word of life, for a boast to me in the day of Messiah, that I've not run in vain or labored in vain. What allows us to be set apart? What allows us to be distinctly other than the polyculturalism of the world is holding on to the word of life. That by us fiercely holding on to that no matter what circumstances we face, no matter what the culture advocates, no matter what is accepted and tolerated and advocated and endorsed, well, no matter how it looks, that we would still adhere to these principles and not move off of them. We will see these words come to pass. We will see every tongue confess. We will hear every tongue confess that Yeshua is the master. We will see every knee bow. This is an absolute reality of all of these other gods and immortals and mighty ones and spirits that are above us and the ones that are below us and in the earth. Every one of them is going to go through this moment. Every one of them. When you have teachers, when you have religious orders, when you have corporations, when you have governments that are advocating an amalgamation of all of these other doctrines, understand this is the fruit of a different spirit at work. And that spirit hates, it's the ancient hate of the dragon, hates those that guard these words, those that revere these words, these that have a love of the truth. But its goal is to move people into a position where they are accepting and tolerating debauchery to such an extent that open practices of the types of idolatrous practices like we read about in 2 Kings, those things will be taking place all around us, and it will be tolerated and accepted and demanded its equal rights, that it has every right to practice that, not knowing that how destructive it is to fill the land with violence, to fill it with bloodshed. Yeshua was very clear about who he was. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Big declaration. The religious universalism of Freemasonry is perennialism garbed in ritual. Theosophy put it forward as a science of religion. Pagan articulation can be found in how Gus de Zerga described the deities associated with the pagan worldview. Quote, deities, like everything else, including ourselves, are manifestations or emanations from the ultimate source of all, end quote. Perennial philosopher and psychonaut Alan Watts offered this taking. I mean, the conception of God as the total energy field of the universe, including both its positive and negative aspects, and in which every part or process is a sort of microcosm or hologram. That is to say, the whole is expressed in or applied by every part. This view strikes me as a cleaner and simpler than monotheism. Popularizing this attitude within academia and the general public was Aldous Huxley's aptly titled anthology, The Perennial Philosophy, pulling together observances from different faiths and drawing philosophical connections. His inspiration nonetheless remained grounded in the Hindu paradigm. One modern commentator on transformational culture reminds us that Huxley's metaphysics was about translating the teachings of Ramakrishna Vedanta. Huxley asked the reader to turn away from theological separation. Quote, God may be worshipped and contemplated in any of his aspects, but to persist in worshiping only one aspect to the exclusion of all the rest is to run into grave spiritual peril. Thus, if we approach God with preconceived idea that he is exclusively the personal, transcendental, all-powerful ruler of the world, we run the risk of becoming entangled in a religion of rites, proprietary sacrifices, sometimes of the most horrible nature, and legalistic observances. Perennial philosophy has been equated to the great work, the primordial tradition, ancient wisdom, and the secret doctrine. It seeks the essence. Now carry on here onto the next page. We'll carry on here on the next page. There is, I believe, a natural attraction to mysticism, and certain personalities seem more intuitively drawn to it. But the methods used to achieve a numinous state are just that, techniques for a self-directed condition of being. A feeling of connection and expansion is encountered. I too have felt this in specific situations and have had it induced through environmental stimuli. It is a feeling of flow, one linked to neurochemical changes in brain states. But as evidenced in the field of religious studies, this feeling can be associated with spiritual realities, and I believe can be manipulated to that end, acting as a doorway into supernatural realms. Unchecked or unintentionally pursuing such a state of a spiritual condition, I contest, and others have argued, can be psychologically disrupting and spiritually deceptive. Moreover, there are no biblical examples or commands for the mystical approach to one's personal life. Rather, Christians are to be guided by the Spirit of God in all truth, to pray with rational thought, to be of sound mind, and through Christ Jesus to be confident in our salvation. Feelings are part of our human makeup, but our standing with God is not dependent on how you or I feel, neither in our experiences nor in our works. It is dependent on what Jesus Christ has already done. Romans 12:2 tells us, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God." This is not a state of emptying, but a state of filling our minds with what God desires. It is relational and rational. It is relational and rational, an action centered in God's revealed word, proving what is good and acceptable. It is not enigmatic and ephemeral. These were the hallmark clues that gave me a strong spiritual conviction to leave that church, to get away from Flatirons, was when the pastor was beginning to guide people in the emptying of their minds and the allowance for what would be a spiritual soaking in, a vacuum of thought, to allow this meditation to take place. When he was up on stage doing that and leading the people into that practice, I understood very clearly what was being done to the room. Not many people there really picked up on it, though, because they had been lulled incrementally into an acceptance and a tolerance of this mysticism. And because it had been working its way in very intentionally and very carefully over the course of months. And by the time it was fully manifesting itself, fully revealing itself for who it was, it had devoured a huge amount of the actual true biblical doctrines that were still adhering there, the ones that were still being utilized in that place. It had vacated them. And instead, this is the compromise that fills up the room. And this is what is taking over so many of our churches, and why we will see churches that are doing Reiki healing classes and churches that are doing yoga classes. You'll see this movement, this infestation of this mysticism into the body of Messiah, just like what happened in the days of the House of Israel with Jeroboam, and the son of Nebat, who is getting the people of Israel to sin. The reason that happened, listen, the reason that Jeroboam was so deceived to make golden calves, again, like young bulls, he made 2 golden calves. I should go back for a second. The first king over the house of Israel. So you had King David, then you had King Solomon, his son. Then he had a son named Rehoboam. During the days of Rehoboam, the house of Israel separated itself from the house of Judah. That king that was elected over the house of Israel was Jeroboam, in other translations. That king was afraid. He had this fear that he was not going to be culturally relevant. He had a fear that he wouldn't get the numbers and he wouldn't be able to have the retention of his people, because in the scriptures, in the Torah, you're commanded to go up to Jerusalem, to the house of Yahuah, 3 times a year. All the men of Israel are commanded to go up there for Passover, for Shavuot, and for the Feast of Sukkot. There's these like times when you're supposed to go gather. He was afraid in his heart that the people would begin to go back to the house of Judah and would leave him. And so he made these golden calves, and he set one up there in Shamaron, Samaria, and he set another one up in the north, in the tribe of Dan's territory. This is the same area where they had other priests of Dan that were operating. They read about in the very last few chapters of the book of Judges. You'll hear about this crazy story of this Levite who makes a ephod and silver molded, and he's literally practicing all this idolatry, but he's the only Levite. And so he becomes the Levite, the leader of the priest class up for the tribe of Dan. So tribe of Dan becomes the center point of a lot of this idolatrous practices that go on in the house of Israel. Anyways, Jeroboam's fear about losing people, not having enough people in his church, is literally the fundamental stinking thing that led them to these practices of idolatry, where they went and picked up these traditions of the people that they came to purge out of the land, and they adopted them for themselves, and they purged out of there the purity of the kingdom. That same issue is what was at the heart of why so many churches compromise, and they pick up these other methodologies because they want to still have an impact. They still want to have people come into their doors. They wanted everybody to know, to bump into Jesus. That was the motto of what Flat Irons was about, that we wanted a safe place to bump into Jesus. Well, they made a safe place for people to bump into Satan. They really did, and that sucks, but they fundamentally did. I sat in the front of that room when they played the song on the stage, Eminem's song with Rihanna called Monster, Getting Along with the Demons in Your Head. Like, then they did the worship songs after that. They had gotten to this level where they were so degraded in their convictions that they no longer were hating sin. They weren't, and it was brutal to see. It was exhausting and frustrating to see that, because there was such potential there. There was so much potential there, but it was lost and squandered along the way. And so when I read in the scriptures about what was going on in historical context for these people, it's much easier for me to have an understanding of why it's happening today. And it makes me all the more excited that the Bible still has the answers. The scripture still has the answers to the cultural problems that we're facing today, and whatever you might be facing. If you're somebody who's sitting there watching this in Bavaria, or you're somebody who's sitting there experiencing this situation and you live in Queensland, Australia, the situations of what you're encountering, the cultural milieu, the situational spiritual environment that you're living in, those circumstances are going to be found in the scripture. You will be able to find in there so many of the same things, because the same entities, these same demons, these same immortals that plagued mankind thousands of years ago are plaguing mankind today. They don't just go away. They have very effective means of capturing the souls of men and using them. And they worked then, and they're not going to change it today. So that's why I encourage you to study this word, to know what it has to say, so you can engage and seek to set people free from it. I'm going to read on here because you're going to jump into Carl Jung. My contention of why that church went so off the rails, because they adopted this type of mysticism. The perennial philosophy of Alan Watts contributed to the infusion of Eastern mysticism into the West. Similarly, Carl Jung presented a psychologized version, and Joseph Campbell, who popularized comparative religions, blending psychology, mythology, and perennialism. The intellectual and experiential influence of each of these men, including Huxley as a major source of input, profoundly shaped the early years of the Esalen Institute. Huxley's perennial view encouraged religious experimentation. In religion, as in natural science, experience is determined only by experience. Such a Vedanta-based thinking, along with Aleister Crowley's earlier democratizing of decadence, was heady fodder for the 1960s. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to pick up back where we were in 2 Kings, because this fruit carried on, the blending of these different practices carried on to such an extent that the Father literally had to intervene and to preserve a remnant. But understand, this is the same kind of fruits that we're going to see in the diaspora, scattered amongst the lost sheep of the house of Israel, those that are hearing the voice of the good shepherd and who are trying to come back to him and trying to pursue him with all of their heart, with all of their soul, with all of their mind, with all of their strength. As we begin to do that, you are going to see and experience these issues going on in the communities around you. And the more versed we are in what the word has to say about it and how the Father dealt with it, the better we will be able to be effective at tearing down the strongholds around us. Let's carry on. So Yahuwah was very enraged. Verse 18. So Yahuwah was very enraged with Yisrael and removed them from his presence. None was left but the tribe of Yehudah alone. Yehudah also did not guard the commands of Yahuwah their Elohim, but walked in the laws of Yisrael, which they made. You see this again? Man-made traditions, man-made laws. They following and picking up traditions of men. You'll see this over and over again. It makes me want to throw my head through a building. And Yahuwah rejected all the seed of Yisrael and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his presence. And he tore Yisrael from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam son of Nebat sovereign. And Jeroboam drove Yisrael from following Yahuwah and made them commit a great sin. And the children of Yisrael walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he did. They did not turn away from them until Yahuwah removed Yisrael from his presence, as he spoke by all his servants, the prophets. So Yisrael was exiled from their land to Asher, as it is to this day. Hold on one second. Check this out. This is a crazy story. This is a part that you don't ever get in the highlight reels of life. And the sovereign of Asher, okay, so the king of Assyria, brought people from Babel, from Kutha, and from Awa, and from Hamath, and from Sepharwaim, and placed them in the cities of Shamaron instead of the children of Yisrael. And they took possession of Shamaron and dwelt in its cities. And it came to be at the beginning of their dwelling there that they did not fear Yahuwah. And Yahuwah sent lions among them, which were killing among them. Isn't that awesome? I think that's one of the greatest little single liners in the entire Bible. It's like they conquer, they come in and they're like, let's send in our own people into their land. They're like, yeah, we'll go occupy their territories and their cities. And yeah, they didn't fear Yahuwah. So he's like, you know what? I know how to put the fear on them. Send lions among them. Send lions among them. You want to learn for a second about the power and the potential of lions and just the ferocity of what cats can do? There is a book that is called It is called The Man Eaters of Kumoan. 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 You want to hear about man eaters and just how difficult it is to survive and live in an environment where animals are predating on man. Now, in this book, it was fascinating. You guys, if you guys watch my channel before, you'll find if you just type in lions into the search of Nathan Reynolds videos, you'll find some lions pop in there quite a bit because I'm always fascinated by these stories. I have this deep, obnoxious dream, ridiculous, of fighting a lion. Just mano a mano. Me just fighting that bear or fighting a lion just with a knife, just a primal like fight in the pit with a lion on a snowy day. There's this guy in the scriptures called Benaiah. He's one of the Gibborim, mighty man of valor. One of David's, he ends up becoming David's head of his security team. He ends up becoming the leader of all the army of Israel under the reign of King Solomon. Savage warrior. Anyways, one of the things he does is he climbs into a pit with a lion on a snowy day and kills it. I just love that story. First time I read that as a child, I was like, I want to be that man. I want to be that man someday. So I've seized every opportunity to climb into a pit with a lion. The only pit of an actual lion I ever found was in Florida, and I climbed into the pit. Big old den that it had dug. A tree had tipped over in Florida, and this thing was stalking stuff on the farm where I was living, and it was stalking. We were finding its footprints everywhere, and finally, the Thanksgiving morning, we're sitting down to eat, and the children come running in, and they're like, the lion is here, the lion is here, we saw it. They're screaming frantically, and I'm like, get my spear, because I have a spear for this moment. Now, I had been waiting my entire life for this moment. I was like, yes, it's on, son. So we can jump in the golf cart and we run back to my RV, and I grab the spear that's at the door of my RV, and I'm like, it's game on, son. I also put on my kukri machete because honestly, that's the tool I actually know how to use more. I've never really wielded a spear in combat, not once. I don't have a single kill with a spear. I've got a lot of experience with a machete, the kukri machete. Praise Yah for the kukri machete. Anyways, and I put on a headlamp because obviously stinking going into a pit, you know what I'm saying? Light blinds. I'm going to use every photonic barrier I get, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, we drive over there like a chariot. I've got my spear out the door of this thing. It's ridiculous. Chelsea had the footage of this. We put in a video one time. Somebody's going to find it somewhere. Anyways, it took off across the farm. We get over to this giant ladder that they have set up going on to the other side of the farm, where it's just dense jungle. Florida stinking savage jungle on the other side of where the farm is. And I go to climb up this ladder. It's this huge ladder to go over the fence and to get down on the other side. And I end up leaving the spear over there because it's just jungle. I'm like, I'm not going to take a spear through there. This thing's super long, Maasai spear. It's more of a throwing spear, come to find out. I'm like, I have no idea how to effectively use it. I've tried throwing it a lot. I was never great with it, not even once. But I would walk around the forest with it, and I felt a lot better because we were having bears chase us in Colorado like crazy. The property that we were living on, the lady worshipped creation rather than creator, and she set up an altar, a little shrine to bears. She would just feed black bears there. Insane. And it was right in front of where our RV was, so we had to deal with black bears constantly. Anyways, I digress. The wilderness is ridiculous, and you got a bunch of crazies out there in Boulder County, Colorado. But anyways, I left the spear on the other side of the fence because I'm like, what the heck am I going to do with this spear? I don't even know how to climb a ladder with the spear. I don't even know what to do with the spear. I'm already not super comfortable on ladder, so it wasn't exciting for me. Anyways, I climb over to the other side of this thing and I get to the top and I look down and sure enough, there's a stinking pit there, son. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's game on. So I turn on my headlamp to full. I think it was just 1,200 lumens, whatever, 50,000 candles. It was a decent headlamp. I love Nightcore flashlights. But I crawl down the ladder onto the other side and I pull out my machete and I prepare myself and I enter into the pit. And it was empty, and I was devastated. And right at that moment, I hear this horrifically intense growl behind me. And I was like, oh, yeah, son. He's over there. And all the children start screaming, he's over here, he's over here, he's over here. And I go running back up the ladder and climb down the other side of it. And they're all pointing that direction. Like, go get him, go get him, go get him. And so I start running along the fence line as fast as I can. And as I'm running, I roll my ankle and fall on my face. Levels me. Now I get up as quick as I can to try to not be totally humiliated and embarrassed in front of the children. And I go tearing off. And sure as stinking enough, as I'm running, you can hear this creature crashing through the forest on the other side of the fence. He escapes me because he's a stinking lion, Florida Panther is what some people call it. I obviously was under threat of life. That's why I was chasing it. I was posing imminent danger to myself and those around me. That's why I was pursuing it. I know how laws work, you guys, just not all of them. I wanted to hunt that thing and kill it in front of all of those children and be the hero, but I got humbled and I was brought low. So I didn't have my moment, but I've had this fascination with hunting down and chasing lions. And so I've read the books that were written by these guys who would go out and hunt man-eaters. That book in particular chronicles the story of this guy who was called in predominantly by the British. The British were doing a lot of work over in India to try to colonize it, obviously, because they're the true tyrants of the nations. Terrifyingly bad dudes, y'all. The Lord Mayor of London, some of the most savage dragons on the earth, you guys. They literally are under the red dragon. Something to consider. I digress. Anyways, there was a lion that was, or a tiger specifically, that was over there. What was the name of that? The Champawat. This tiger had killed eventually 436 people. One tiger, 436 kills, confirmed kills. It's crazy. It's like snipers, They're like, yeah, we're not totally sure. We just found an arm. But like this thing was just perpetually predating on people. And his conclusion in the book was that the only times that an animal like a lion or a leopard became a man-eater, he said it was almost always found that it was very old or it had a major dental tooth, a major injury. Those seem to be the two biggest circumstances that were surrounding like why this lion suddenly just began to eat everybody. And I mean eat a lot of people. And not just like kill them, eat them completely. The other great stories that I've always loved was The Ghost in the Darkness, which was a Sean Connery film back in the day about the lions, the two lions that were stalking people in Africa. Great story as well. Anyways, I encourage you guys to go dive in because what you'll find is and what he writes about a lot in that book was the experience of what the people were like who were living in that environment under the fear, under the dread. He said it was as if they were living prisoners. They would only be in their houses. They wouldn't travel at all. They were terrified to go out and get water. They were terrified to go out and harvest crops because that tended to be where they were getting picked off by the watering hole, the well, or by their fields. They were getting picked off and eaten. And so there was literally famine happening. People were starving to death because they were so scared to go out in their communities. And it created this level of dread, total dread in the environment to where the people were paralyzed by it. There's this time where he zooms in the story and he talks about this woman whose sister was taken and being mauled by the tiger in front of her. And she fought to try to save her sister's life. And the tiger overpowered her and dragged her off. And the woman never spoke again. She literally was so traumatized. She never spoke again. And it became this just experience where the hunter would have to go into the area and try to get to know from the locals the habits, the hunting nature. He was trying to learn the pattern of life for this creature that he was trying to stalk. And so he would really get close with the villagers over the course of time, and people would see him eventually as this protector when he was around, and they began to feel finally some semblance of safety, and they began to emerge from their houses in this prison, self-inflicted prison that they were living in over the course of that time. And that guy's story is fascinating because when he finally tracks down this tiger, he ends up using basically one of his guys as bait. It's pretty hilarious. It's pretty terrifying too because the guide figures it out. The guide figures out that he's the bait at one point in this and almost ruins the entire thing. But he eventually kills this tiger and he skins it and he takes it back and he takes that skin and he brings it to the woman who had stopped speaking for all those years and he gives it to her as a gift. And it helped to free her from that dread and from the trauma of what she'd lived through. I just think that's one of the most incredible stories I've ever heard in my life. I am fascinated by accounts of man-eaters like that. And I think, the world is so much more interesting than any video game could ever hope to intrigue us by. I'm just saying, like, that's amazing. You could be that guy. Do you understand? You could be that woman in the lives of somebody else around you to free them from the paralysis analysis that has kept them plagued by traumas that they have been afflicted with their entire life. We have a society that is so oppressive and so demonically infested that our best friends and family members all around us are being ruled by the fear of men, ruled by the fear of failure, ruled by the fear of lack, the fear of not succeeding, the fear of death. Our society and the spiritual nature of man is so plagued by the lions of corporations and of greediness for gain and those that are seeking to steal, kill, and destroy all of the righteous things on the earth and to instead give us a altered meta and metaverse in its place, to give us an alternate reality, a quick escapism. And because of that, we are voluntarily living in these isolated, self-inflicted prisons through our digital devices and not experiencing the reality of life. But let me tell you, the Father came to set us free from our prisons. He came to set us free from the fear of man, but it will only come from the fear of him. We must learn the fear of Yahuah if we are ever to find freedom from the things that steal, kill, and devour our lives. And you know what? That's literally what ended up happening here. Check this out. Let me go back there for a second. Boy, it's getting cold. Hallelujah. Ready for this? Go back for 1 second. So this is what they did. And they spoke to the sovereign of Asher, saying, the nations whom you have removed and placed in the cities of Shamaron do not know the right ruling of the Elohim of the land. And he has sent lions among them, and see, they are slaying among them, because they do not know the right ruling of the Elohim of the land. And the sovereign of Asher commanded, saying, send one of the priests whom you exiled from there to go there. Let him go and dwell there, and let him teach them the right ruling of the Elohim of the land. And one of the priests whom they had exiled from Shamaron, came and dwelt in Bethel and taught them how to fear Yahuah. Fundamentally, y'all, this is one of the greatest things we can ever teach the people around us and teach to the lives of our children is the fear of Yahuah. If you do not have it, and that was the single greatest thing that was lacking in the non-denominational churchianity of what I was in, was the lack of the fear of Yahuah. It was the fear of Yahuah that set me free from the fear of death. It wasn't death of my body. It was literally the entity death that I feared, the family spirit that ruled the Reynolds family and the Zarnowski family. It's that spirit that they've made their covenant with. That's what I feared. I feared the retribution of him coming to call and harvest my soul. I feared that until the day I saw Yeshua come and stand between death and myself and say, he is mine. You can't have him. It was in that moment when I was bleeding to death outside of my parents' basement, staring at the backside of Yeshua and hearing him rebuke death, the familiar spirit. That was when I began to have a lot more of the fear of Yahuah in my life. That was when I began to see fear in the eyes of the enemy. I saw fear in death's eyes. And that was something I'd never seen before. I had seen death be so powerful. I had seen the power of splitting the shadows and walking between realms. I had seen the power of a lot of these occult practices in front of my face. I had known the power of the dark side. And let me tell you, none of it holds a shadow against the all-consuming fire of Yahuah Elohim Sevaoth, the Lord hosts, the Lord of hosts. He is the mighty conqueror of nations. He is the one who holds the world in his hand. And let me tell you, there is none like him, and none will stand before him. He is an all-consuming fire. And I have seen that fire destroy my fear of death. And you know what? I hope and pray that you guys will learn the fear of Yahuah, and that wisdom that comes from knowing him will empower you and strengthen you and deliver you from the fears of death and the fear of men, and grant you the ability to walk boldly in his ways and to not compromise and to not give in to the call of cowards. Anyways, y'all, I hope you guys go study the man-eaters. I'm telling you, it's a fascinating endeavor, and it will be one that you can learn and glean a lot from. And may we all pray that Yahuwah raises up more and more set-apart men and women to teach us the fear of Yahuwah, to regard him, and to teach us the ways of following his son and being filled with the mind of Yeshua every day. I love y'all so much. I thank you guys for your encouragement and your support and your prayers. May you live ferociously, y'all, every single day of your life, because the days may be evil, but you, beloved brother and sister, were born for such a time as this. I love you guys. I'll talk to you soon.